The subject of this debate, I suppose, is a number of terms: power, privilege, elite, and art. The relationship between art and elites, between art and power, is extremely various across history, and we'll be interrogating that. On my extreme right, if I might put it that way, is Colin MacCabe, who's a literary critic, a film producer, an author, most recently, I assume most recently, of Perpetual Carnival, essays on film and literature. On my immediate left is Paloma Strelitz, who's a founder of, or rather co-founder of the Turner Prize-winning Assemble Collective. And on my extreme left is Jenifer Scott, who's the director of the historic Dulwich Picture Gallery. So we're going to begin with Colin. Your 3 minutes.
Okay. In the late 50s, Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein in New York began to use consumer goods and comics as the material for their painting. And in a way, that break between the elite and the popular was the practical example of what would become cultural studies. And at the same time in England, Raymond Williams was elaborating his view of culture, going back into the 19th century to find an account of culture that would honour both his own working class upbringing and the great virtue of solidarity, as well as the elite texts which he had studied at Cambridge. Now that isn't the first time you get this breakdown. You can go back both to the modernists and romantics and find a complication of the notion of elite and popular culture. But it does mean that we now live in an era where it seems to me that that distinction means almost nothing. And if you wanted an example of that, you could take the date in 1992 when the Sunday Times actually rebranded their arts section as culture, covering every kind of cultural production. That doesn't, of course, solve the problem of either the value of particular artistic or cultural productions, or the question of how art reaches its audience. But I think I would just end by saying that in my time, at the end of my time as a cultural bureaucrat, access was the key new Labour word to cover all art. And the trouble about access is that it's extremely misleading as a word, in the sense that it both means a very physical, it's the ability of a disabled person to get access to something, but it also means that in getting that physical access, you get a set of entitlements. And when Jimmy Wales says that, with Wikipedia, we now have everybody has access to all of knowledge, you have to really question, if you take the simplest, you haven't got access if you can't read, and it goes on. There's access always brings with it a further set of questions, and it does not seem to me a useful word in discussing these matters.
Jenifer?
I think this is a really interesting topic for us to be discussing today. I am fortunate enough to be the director of the UK's oldest purpose-built art gallery. It opened to the public in 1817, and with that comes huge responsibility. And the thing that I try to keep grounded about is the fact that ultimately Dulwich Picture Gallery is about great art. And I like to think about the way that that art functions and the power that that art has. For instance, we have a painting in the picture gallery, which is a portrait of a lady called Venetia Stanley. And she died in 1633. In 1633, her husband lost her. A man lost his wife in 1633, nearly 400 years ago. It happens to us all that we lose somebody, but the man in question was Sir Kenelm Digby. Sir Kenelm Digby was a member of high society, of the elite. He moved in circles that meant that he was familiar with an artist called Anthony van Dyck, who had come across from Antwerp to paint the royal family. And in the early 1630s, he was painting Charles I and his family. And so when Kenelm lost his wife, his first instinct was to call upon Van Dyck to come and paint her corpse in bed, because that was his way of coming to terms with his loss. Now, I think the point you raised, Philip, about patronage is so important, because Van Dyck would have never had access to Kenelm Digby's grief had Kenelm himself not had the wealth to pay for Van Dyck to come. And there is a certain amount of power and control that comes with a commission of that type. But in my experience of it, once an artist is there on the scene, then they take control. No matter what the limitations of a commission, an artist has the ability within a certain framework, but we all work within a framework, and that is where creativity can flourish best. The artist then takes control of the situation. And Kenelm Digby wrote about this painting after it had been finished and said, Van Dyck painted my late wife perfectly. He got every detail right. Apart from, he added a flower. He added a flower on the bed that was falling apart, that was dying. Van Dyck took that moment and the privilege of going into an intimate, grief-ridden state, a room, and to have that ability to go in and get close to Kenelm's late wife, and then to paint her and add in some poetic license. And there's something that I noticed when I look at that painting, and come to Dulwich Picture Gallery, see it for yourselves.
That is the advert, by the way.
That's
She's
the
going to
commercial.
give you a map at the end.
I will. But when you come in and look at that painting, you'll notice that it's painted at a very strange angle, because what Van Dyck decided to do was to paint Mrs. Digby as if he was leaning right over her. And when I look at that, and it's changed in the way I look at it over the years, when I look at that, I think that actually Van Dyck has channeled the way that Kenelm would have leant over her as if he was going to give her a last kiss. And Van Dyck chose to do that. And it is heart-stoppingly beautiful, and means a great deal to me, even more so since I lost somebody recently, my mother, the most important person to me. And it means so much to me, that painting. So despite the wealth and the elitism and all of the trappings around the creation of this painting, ultimately it's something deeply human. And that, for me, is a way in for people to great art. The fact that it exists at all means that we can have a connection to a human emotion 400 years ago that can feel as current as if it happened just yesterday, because we can all understand loss, and we can understand great art, and we can understand the poetry, that moment when Van Dyck made those crucial decisions to create a painting that has so much power. So the responsibility that I have and my team have at Dulwich Picture Gallery is to try and open that up in various ways to as many people as possible, because then people can find those connections and can ultimately find themselves in great art.
Paloma?
Thank you. So as I've sort of introduced, I'm one of the co-founders of Assemble, and we really work across the fields of architecture, art and design. I've also just finished the design of the new Goldsmith Centre for Contemporary Art, which is open this month in South London, in New Cross, as a sort of new free art centre. So maybe this is a kind of a call out to coming to art centres in South London, having a nice day out. I think it's why this sort of topic of today I think really resonates with my interests. So, culture of improvisation and hands-on making is a really important aspect of Assemble's work, and to us it makes it possible to sort of read and partake in the city a bit differently, so that it's no longer quite so opaque or unmalleable or unquestionable, but instead sort of full of possibility for how you might take part in it. And I think that that sort of runs alongside our interest in creating spaces that really support different contexts of sort of forms of art practice, and that really has significance across the spectrum, from the way we begin to play as children to the way we continue to learn as adults. So I'm kind of interested in spaces of art production as spaces of knowledge, and the cultural value and tools that they can equip us with to begin to shape new realities. And so I'm going to very, very briefly talk about two Assemble projects that kind of, I suppose, speak to the title of this conversation, which is about how art can open the minds of the many. So firstly, I want to sort of mention Black Horse Workshop, which is a workshop that we set up in Walthamstow, and it really takes the spirit of building as a sort of collective activity, and also I suppose the idea of a studio culture, and turns that into a form of public library. But at Black Horse, the main resource is tools instead of books, and the librarians are technicians.
For more debates, talks and interviews, Subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.